72 hours ago, something happened over the Baltic Sea that shattered everything I thought I understood about global financial security and institutional confidence. Russian aircraft didn't just probe NATO airspace, they exposed a fundamental weakness in the entire Western security architecture that underpins international economic stability. What terrifies me as an economist isn't the military hardware itself. It's what this Baltic Sea incident revealed about how catastrophically we've miscalculated the economic implications of declining American institutional credibility. There were three economic warning signs everyone missed, three institutional confidence indicators that were flashing red, and the third one explains why this Pentagon humiliation was economically inevitable. Standing in my office this morning reviewing classified economic assessments that connect military credibility to market confidence, I'm watching the collapse of assumptions that have guided Western monetary policy for decades. The economic intelligence behind military humiliation, picture this from an institutional economics perspective. 0347 Moscow time, Russian Su-35 fighters lift off from Kaliningrad. The moment I read that detail in the economic intelligence briefing, my understanding of institutional risk fundamentally changed. These weren't aging Soviet aircraft conducting routine probes. They were Russia's most advanced operational fighters, accompanied by Su-34 fighter bombers equipped with electronic warfare systems that Western economic intelligence believed existed only in limited numbers. Here's what nobody in financial markets wants to admit: we were wrong about Russian institutional capabilities, completely catastrophically wrong. Within minutes, NATO sensors detected electronic warfare signatures unlike anything previously catalogued. Not the broad-spectrum interference we'd studied before, but sophisticated adaptive electronic attacks specifically designed to degrade Western military communications while maintaining perfect Russian coordination. From an economic perspective, this represents something far more dangerous than military embarrassment. It demonstrates systematic institutional preparation that suggests Russia has been planning alternatives to Western-dominated systems for far longer than our economic models predicted. Why this military incident threatens economic stability? As someone who has spent decades studying how institutional confidence affects global capital flows, I immediately recognize the broader implications of this Baltic Sea incident. Military credibility and economic credibility are fundamentally interconnected in the modern international system. When the Pentagon cannot effectively monitor or counter Russian capabilities in NATO's own backyard, it raises profound questions about American institutional reliability across all domains. Swedish and Finnish air defense networks reported something that should alarm every economist. Russian aircraft were conducting systematic electronic mapping of alliance defensive systems. Every NATO communication, every defensive protocol being monitored, analyzed, catalogued. Think about the economic implications. While Western financial institutions were congratulating themselves on sanctions' effectiveness, Russia was quietly studying Western institutional weaknesses, learning our patterns, mapping our vulnerabilities. How long have they been conducting this systematic intelligence gathering across economic and financial domains? That's the question haunting central bankers right now. The Pentagon's response reveals deeper economic vulnerabilities. Danish F-16s, German Eurofighters, Polish F-16s scrambled under NATO protocols. The pilots involved thought they were conducting routine intercepts. What they encountered instead forced them to file mission reports that triggered emergency assessments of Western institutional credibility at the highest levels. According to classified debriefings I've reviewed, Russian aircraft demonstrated coordination and electronic warfare sophistication that exceeded economic intelligence estimates by significant margins. One Danish pilot reported that his aircraft's communication systems experienced selective interference that suggested Russians were probing to find exactly which frequencies NATO uses under operational conditions. From an institutional economics perspective, this represents devastating intelligence gathering. Russia was learning the precise operational details of how Western security institutions function under pressure. The Russian aircraft approached within 30 nautical miles of Swedish airspace carrying R-37M long-range missiles with engagement ranges exceeding 200 kilometers. Let me translate what this means for institutional confidence. In any conflict scenario, fighters operating from Russian territory could engage critical Western military infrastructure without entering NATO airspace themselves. Feel the economic implications of that reality. The institutional guarantee that underpins Western financial confidence, American military supremacy has exploitable vulnerabilities that markets are only beginning to price in. How this exposes Western economic imperial overextension. For decades, NATO's Baltic defense strategy assumed Western institutions could establish technological dominance rapidly through superior economic resources. Those assumptions are now under severe stress because they were based on economic intelligence that apparently underestimated Russian institutional development by substantial margins. The Pentagon's classified response shows concern extending far beyond this single incident. Emergency institutional assessments are being conducted across multiple economic and military theaters. The question keeping economic policymakers awake: if Western institutions were this wrong about Russian capabilities in the Baltic, what else have our economic models missed about competitive institutional development? From Moscow's perspective, this Baltic demonstration serves multiple economic purposes, and the strategic calculation is economically elegant. First, it signals to international markets that any Western intervention defending Eastern European economies would be far costlier than current financial planning assumes. Second, the timing precisely as Sweden and Finland complete NATO economic integration delivers a clear message to global investors. Western institutional expansion brings expanded economic vulnerabilities. But there's a third purpose that no economic analyst is discussing publicly. This was a stress test of Western institutional resilience. Moscow wanted to see how Western economic and military institutions would respond, how quickly our systems would adapt, whether our integrated defense would function as advertised under systematic pressure. They received comprehensive answers about Western institutional limitations. The economic imperial transition this incident represents. This Baltic Sea incident reflects the acceleration of transition from unipolar to multipolar economic systems that I've been tracking since 2017. Russia and China are systematically developing institutional capabilities specifically designed to challenge American economic dominance in regions they consider vital to their economic security. This isn't random military modernization. It's coordinated development of economic and military capabilities that exploit vulnerabilities in Western institutional structure. The United States faces a fundamental economic dilemma this Baltic incident illuminates. American economic and military institutions cannot be equally strong everywhere simultaneously. The economic pivot toward Asia to counter China necessarily reduces institutional resources for European economic security. Russia understands this economic reality perfectly and is exploiting the gap between American institutional commitments and actual capabilities with surgical precision. I've spent decades studying how economic empires manage strategic overextension. The institutional pattern is always the same. First comes economic denial, insisting that current institutional structure remains adequate. Then comes recognition, usually triggered by some operational failure that cannot be explained away through economic policy adjustments. We're somewhere between those two stages right now, and the Baltic Sea incident represents a critical data point in that institutional transition. Why European economic security can no longer rely on American institutional dominance. European NATO members confront an uncomfortable economic reality this Baltic incident makes unavoidable. They cannot rely indefinitely on American military and economic institutional superiority to guarantee their economic security. Defense spending has increased since Russia's Ukraine invasion, but remains economically insufficient to offset growing Russian institutional capabilities and declining American economic attention to European security needs. From an economic perspective, this represents a fundamental structural adjustment that financial markets are only beginning to price in. The three economic warning signs everyone ignored. Remember those three institutional warning signs I mentioned? Here they are from an economic intelligence perspective. First warning, in 2019, Russian electronic warfare units demonstrated unprecedented capabilities during exercises near Kaliningrad. Western economic analysts dismissed these as exaggerated performance claims that didn't threaten actual Western institutional capabilities. Second warning, in 2022, during the Ukraine conflict, Russian forces showed adaptive electronic warfare tactics that didn't match Western economic intelligence assessments. We explained it away as battlefield improvisation rather than systematic institutional development. Third warning, throughout 2024, Russian military publications openly discussed doctrinal shifts toward electronic warfare dominance. Western economic models didn't take this seriously because it contradicted our assumptions about their institutional technical capabilities. 3 warnings about institutional development, all ignored by economic planners, and now we're facing the economic consequences of institutional miscalculation. This represents competitive institutional adaptation that economic models fail to predict. Adversaries systematically developing capabilities to exploit perceived weaknesses in Western economic and military institutional structure. The economic crisis stability implication. From an institutional economics perspective, the Baltic incident creates a dangerous economic confidence gap, a period where one side perceives temporary institutional advantage while the other fears that disadvantage may become permanent. Historically, these institutional confidence gaps are extraordinarily dangerous for economic stability because they create incentives for preventive economic action on one side and preemptive institutional responses on the other. NATO cannot ignore this institutional capability demonstration without undermining alliance economic credibility with global markets. But every Western response enhanced military patrols, additional institutional deployments, new economic basing arrangements, Moscow will interpret as preparation for economic warfare, justifying further institutional buildup. This represents classic institutional security dilemma dynamics with profound implications for global economic stability. How this connects to global economic realignment. The Baltic escalation operates across multiple economic domains simultaneously. Russian demonstrations in European waters must be understood alongside Chinese economic activities in the Taiwan Strait and Iranian institutional operations in the Persian Gulf. These represent coordinated economic and institutional challenges to American global dominance designed to force Washington to choose between competing economic priorities while draining resources across multiple fronts. The broader economic lesson strikes at the heart of Western institutional culture. Military and economic superiority is temporary and contextual, not permanent institutional reality. American economic dominance during the unipolar moment was built on institutional advantages that peer economic competitors have been systematically studying and developing countermeasures against. Historical precedents suggest great economic powers typically struggle with institutional transition. The British Empire faced similar institutional challenges as German industrial capacity and American economic power challenged British institutional dominance. The question facing Western economic policymakers is whether American institutional leadership can adapt gracefully to reduced relative economic power, or whether institutional inertia will prevent adequate adaptation until economic crisis forces recognition of new institutional realities. The economic trajectory we're on, the Pentagon's shock at Russian Baltic capabilities, should serve as a strategic economic wake-up call, but institutional inertia may prevent adequate economic adaptation until crisis forces recognition that the institutional landscape has fundamentally changed. The institutional trajectory we're on is economically unsustainable. Either Western institutions find ways to credibly restore economic and military deterrence through substantial institutional investments, or Western economic institutions must accept a new reality where Russia and China maintain localized institutional advantages in regions they consider economically vital. From an institutional economics perspective, what happened over the Baltic Sea may be remembered as the moment when the illusion of permanent Western institutional superiority finally collided with peer institutional competition reality in a multipolar economic world. Not through dramatic economic collapse, but through a routine military intercept mission that revealed how profoundly the institutional landscape has shifted while Western economic planners weren't paying adequate attention. How Western economic leaders respond to this institutional challenge will determine whether that collision produces institutional adaptation or economic catastrophe. The choice facing Western economic institutions is binary, and the institutional clock is ticking. Because somewhere over the Baltic right now, Russian aircraft are conducting another institutional intelligence gathering mission, and they're watching carefully to analyze whether Western economic institutions have learned anything about the new realities of multipolar institutional competition. Standing in my office today, reviewing the economic implications of this Pentagon humiliation, I can only conclude that we're witnessing the systematic dismantling of the institutional confidence that has underpinned Western economic dominance for decades. The question now isn't whether Western military institutions can restore their credibility. The question is whether Western economic institutions can adapt to a multipolar world where institutional dominance is contested, temporary, and increasingly expensive to maintain. The Baltic Sea incident isn't just military embarrassment, is proof that the institutional foundations of Western economic hegemony are more fragile than our economic models predicted.